Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is episode 7 in the series, To Love and Be Loved. It might surprise you how much a sense of personal freedom is connected to one's ability to love, and how expanding freedom is usually the first step you can take to achieve that goal. In this episode, Dr. Scoresby talks about examples of personal freedom, and then what you can do to increase your sense of freedom and create the foundation for more love and happiness.
Part 2 of the series on expanding your capacity for love is titled Freedom and Love, because freedom is an essential ingredient. I have not counted, but I'm not sure I could count the number of people who do not see a link between the idea of freedom and what love is. It's a little surprising to me because this means that many of us, me probably included, at least as a young married person, do not realize that when you have any kind of situation, even few of them, the normal fear or apprehension that people have when they marry often gets translated into hurt feelings and then anxiety perpetuates mistakes in perception, and then mistakes in perception produce hurt, and the hurt produces fear. And pretty soon, even in most marriages, there are certain things that married people adjust to, and the idea is that you can't tell your spouse everything, or you wouldn't want to make yourself vulnerable here, but you do love your spouse, and he or she is a nice person, and so on. Now, there might be a few where there's total vulnerability and openness, where people magically find each other and live happily ever after. The majority of marriages, however, are a balance between good times and some that are not so good. So, without understanding the nature of the relationship between freedom and love, people often never find a solution. And the reason for this is because the nature of married communication or interaction is sort of redundancy, repetition. When the two people learn to talk to each other, positive or negative, they actually create habitual or ritualized forms of interaction. And then if they are negative, then of course they produce hurt and anxiety. But even so, there can be so many that both people feel tightly tied to each other. And the tighter they feel in response to the other person, the less love they will feel. That is why I have learned to call freedom love's aphrodisiac. And freedom is love's ability to generate or expand one's capacity to feel it. Very successful couples are in marriage, for example, and in parent-child relationships and with friends, are very respectful of freedom. And this freedom is defined as each person having certain areas of individuality. A person can act to make his or her own decisions. The type of freedom I'm talking about is that, plus the idea that we're free from undue fear. We're also free to express openly and free to express ourselves where love and gratitude and kindness are concerned. And so the idea is that if you wanted to expand your capacity for love, you could begin by starting with identifying what you do to enhance and what you do to diminish freedom for yourself. For example, do you start good things in your marriage? Have you discovered that being positive helps you feel more free than negative and critical? Do you make some decisions and consult with your partner? Do you assert your opinions instead of subordinate them? Are you intimidated so that you don't say anything? And so gradually over time you feel controlled and managed? Are you a controlling person? Are you married to a controlling person? All of these things can affect the relative intensity or amount of freedom each person's brain begins to feel. So to increase your capacity or to expand your capacity to love, you need to take a look at freedom. This does not mean that you leave your spouse and say, I'm going to be free from that person. It does not mean that you're free to say whatever you want, no matter if it hurts. If you are guided by the idea of expanding the capacity to love, then freedom is a fairly broad form of behavior that allows you to generate a feeling of safety and security individual responsibility for your behavior and how you communicate and what you do and do not do as a spouse, as a parent, or as a friend. It also relates to what you say and how you say it. So courtesy, for example, respect, a lot of other positive social forms of behavior are actually freedom producing. And that's why we need to follow through on it. It is also true that people who tend to be confident tend to be more free, and the people who are free tend to be more confident. So there are many ways to increase it and expand the concept of freedom and then to apply it to what love means. And anything that would diminish the concept of freedom for you will also diminish your capacity for it. Let me give you an example. High stress levels, for example, often prevent the sensation of freedom and therefore prevent the sensation of love. I have told before on another episode how on one occasion I was traveling a great deal. In my church assignment, I was gone most weekends between Christmas and the end of June. On one occasion, I came home for the weekend in a late night flight from Toronto, Canada, and arrived home, went into the place where we lived at the time. We were living in an apartment while our home was being built. I walked upstairs and crawled into bed and laid down and looked at my wife, and I had no feelings for her. And I thought, well, I'm just tired. But in the morning, I had no feelings for her. And I began to grow afraid that maybe all the stuff that had happened would separate us, and I had lost my capacity to love her. So the following morning at work, I ordered some flowers for her. I'm a little more creative now, as I have mentioned earlier. And when I hung up the phone, though, I noticed a change in my feelings. Now, think just for a moment. She doesn't know the flowers are coming. Nobody else does, as a matter of fact. The only one who does is me. And I have done something positive, and now I feel better. I have learned from that episode and from the experience of many other people that engaging in kind, grateful, and loving things often expands freedom and therefore also expands one's capacity to love. So I've invited people, even if their spouse cannot, for example, just to accelerate their expressions of love. And I get questions like, well, what if he doesn't, or what if she doesn't? I said, it won't matter. Don't overwhelm, but just start the process and see if something happens to you. So they do and come back, and sometimes no, sometimes yes. And then they begin to talk about the whole idea from a perspective of what freedom is. Now, freedom is different for many people, and it may be different from you and your spouse or from you and your child. So it's worthwhile to have several discussions about what it means, when it is likely more present in your life and when it is less likely. And it is also useful to realize that freedom is so connected to many other things that will take many conversations to connect the dots so that you can see a connection between freedom and love and kindness and gratitude, freedom and love in the absence of criticism, freedom and love in the idea of voicing your opinion, freedom with the idea of being patient and listening instead of interrupting, freedom and the idea that we're going to think positive things about ourselves and positive things about our spouse, and freedom and the idea that if we really want, really, truly want, we'll discover that freedom and commitment are connected, and that freedom and commitment and the idea of loyalty are connected. And when we demonstrate loyalty and commitment, we tend to be more free. So as it turns out, quite often people who lose their sense of commitment, who lose their sense of loyalty to a spouse, also feel less free. The very best and worst example of that is somebody who's had an affair in their marriage. When this happens typically, and the person is not beyond feeling, they will discover that the idea of freedom to go do whatever they want has created so much distance and so much guilt that they are not free at all. And in fact, they are less free, and therefore, what they feel is not a genuine form of love most of the time. They might feel some infatuation or some sensory experience that they define as love, but it's certainly not freedom. So if you're married, you could say to your spouse, I'd like to have a conversation with you about freedom as it applies to our marriage. And if you get a blank look, be patient and say, no, seriously, I would like to know what it is to you, what it means to you. I'd like to tell you what it means to me. Then I'd like you to think about it and tell me what you think you do to increase or decrease it. Now, the reason why that's important is that freedom and the idea of sense of responsibility matters a great deal for ourselves. I'll show you why. One Latter-day Saint scripture is this one, that the Messiah will come and produce the remission of sins for every individual and create what? Freedom to act for yourself and to not be acted upon. Isn't that a remarkable set of ideas? The Messiah will come and he will perform his sacrifice and provide a remission of sins, and then people are free to act for ourselves and to not be acted upon. It's a very interesting sort of ideas where the Lord is involved in this process, and it will be important for you to come to understand that freedom is an essential element to the expansion of love, and so therefore it is important for you to learn to talk about it, think about it, even read about it as it applies. So think with me just for a minute about times in your life when you felt the most free, even carefree. And when you felt like that, what was it like? How would you describe it to another person? And if there was a time when you felt caught or tied into the life of somebody else, then you can say, well, I didn't feel very free there. Have you been around a controlling person? Have you been around a critical person or somebody who doesn't like you? Which means that you have worried about what they might say or do, which has reduced your own freedom. Have you been like that? Have you been so threatening to other people that your own freedom and theirs has been diminished as well? Now, if we discovered that it is as priceless as I think it is, we would learn to understand freedom from a personal and interpersonal perspective, as well as a social and governmental perspective. And we would understand that inside our relations, we must provide the freedom to choose. Just accidentally, my wife and I discovered that when, after 2 or 3 years of marriage, neither of us were happy about our money management plan. Initially, we had both agreed that I would take care of it because both of our fathers did. But as we went along, I was not happy because occasionally she didn't write down the amount of the check, which meant that I didn't know what the balance was in the account, and once or twice our bank account bounced, which was an embarrassment to me. Then she didn't like it because she thought that every time she needed or wanted to spend money, she should come and ask, and she didn't think she should have to do that. I agreed. So in an attempt to figure out what to do to solve the problem, we came up with a pretty simple solution. That was nearly all I was capable of at the time. And this solution was, let's organize another checking account that both of us write on. She manages one, I manage one. So we gave each other additional responsibility, or her some anyway. And then the idea was that I would give her bills and we would agree on what they were, and I'd keep some and she would keep some. And so both paid for our standard bills each month. And then we decided to give each other some PIN or personal money that we could spend however we wanted. I tell this story, whenever I do, I smile because the amount of money we were able to give each other as graduate students was $25 a month. And sometimes that was a lot. We had to scramble to do that. And sometimes the worst part about that is that my wife would spend her PIN money on me. And I would say, no, I think we agreed that you would spend it on you. And she'd said, well, I am. And I had to take that as wisdom. And I hope that I reciprocated enough to let her know how much I loved and cared for her. That is, using my PIN money for something she wanted. So as it turns out, our basic decision to carry out money was related to freedom. I point out to you that many times when people argue over money, it's a freedom issue, not a money issue unless there's not enough, and then that's a problem. I would also say to you that most of the time when people argue, they argue because they are afraid, and fear reduces freedom. And so their arguments are about fear, and then the fear reduces their sense of freedom. And it's the lack of freedom, the feeling of control, and being overwhelmed or so on that creates the greatest despondency. Freedom, as it turns out, is important for other reasons in regard to parents and children. If parents do not adjust their discipline and strategy as the children grow older, then children will let you know that, and they will let you know by resistance and oppositional behavior or indifference, that they don't feel free. And sometimes when they don't feel free, they will be disobedient. And when children are really angry about the lack of freedom and some part antisocial, they will choose to disobey on the values that the parents value most. Typically, these will be moral behavior, academic achievement, and religion. And so when a child has placed themselves in opposition to those three forms of behavior, the child is angry, and that's what it looks like. But the anger and the fear they feel of being controlled, they don't want anyone to control them, is actually the absence of freedom. Now, what an adolescent wants, see, is to have the parents throw out all the rules and just say, do whatever you want. But that does not produce the kind of freedom I'm talking about either. And so parents and child have to get together and say, let's work together and let's expand the capacity for freedom. Are there things that the child must do to feel free? Yes. He must be willing to be trustworthy, to say what he'll do and do it, to be warm and tender and so on to his or her parents, and she or he must communicate frequently to keep parents informed. Because if children want to make caring parents anxious, all they have to do is not communicate with them. And then when parents become anxious, they make rules. And they make rules because they believe they must do so to influence the child's behavior, but in so doing, they may restrict his sense of freedom further and thus create something called a deviant amplifying parental discipline strategy that makes problems worse and not better. Now, these examples of freedom apply to any human relationship, even among small children, teenage friends, parents and kids, and married people. And they also, it turns out, to be an important question relative to the government's relation to the population in which it's supposed to serve, and whether or not the government acts to perpetuate freedoms or to restrict them. It's an interesting question that's going on in our society. Interesting comments that people have about whether to be vaccinated or not, and whether or not to wear masks. And these have to do, interestingly, with the concept of freedom. So I recommend freedom to you as a way you can begin expanding your capacity to love. And in the next episode, I'll bring up the third step in the creation or expansion of love. And until then, I hope you find that your efforts will produce positive results for you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit FirstAnswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.